Andria Smythe. I am an assistant professor of economics at Howard University. I hold an MA and a PhD in economics from Tampa University. Um, and before I arrived at Howard as an assistant professor, I taught at Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia. That's a small liberal arts college. I conduct mostly empirical research in the areas of higher education, labor market outcomes, and inequality, with an emphasis on racial inequality. So, right now, my research dossier includes work on student debt and labor market outcomes. I'm looking at how recessions contribute to educational and labor market racial inequality. I'm also looking at intergenerational transfers and wealth inequality within families. And right now, I'm working on a cool project on the role that historically Black colleges and universities play in mitigating racial economic inequality. Okay, so the answer to this question is twofold. The first begins in high school. So I was fortunate to be introduced to economics in high school. And and of course, this early exposure was key in me becoming an economist. I don't remember a lot about that course, but I do remember the supply and demand model and the invisible hand and how the market will adjust buying and selling plants to clear the market. And it resonated with me, one, because I had observed this in my life. So I grew up in Jamaica, and I would frequently go to the Wednesday markets with my mom. And a marketplace is it's kind of like a farmer's market, but they sell more than just produce. But produce is the emphasis there. And I would observe this kind of auction and negotiation taking place in real terms, where buyers and sellers would descend on the particular locale on a particular day, and the buyers and sellers would negotiate price in real time. Not only that, I would see at the end of the day when the sellers have any leftovers remaining, especially produce that's perishable, they would put it on sale to make sure all of it is sold. In economics, we call that market clearing. So in high school, this was the first time I've seen a model, and it was an economics model describe it in that detail. Um, and of course, there's something kind of beautiful when what you observe in the real world kind of comes together in the classroom. And not just that, the graphs were fascinating to me. We were using graphs and math and equation to explain the real world. And thinking about the idea of the invisible hand and having this emergent property where no one was directing the actions of the market or telling the participants what to do, but it was working beautifully. Um, of course, you know, as a high school student, I did not understand kind of the foundation behind the markets. And now, as an economist, I understand and I can see the hand of the government visibly in the market, but it's not visible to the naked eye. And so that was my initial hook. But then the second part of it was in college. So I migrated to the United States to attend college. And this time, my coursework in economics introduced me to the idea of development economics and the economics of developing country. Well, growing up in a developing country, I naturally wanted to understand the issues that I saw around me. And this time, these are the issues of poverty and the social ills that come with poverty and lack of access to basic resources. Um, and also arriving in the United States, I was developing this consciousness about race in the United States and how my experience as a black person growing up in the Caribbean is connected to the experience of blacks in America. But that class on development economics with an emphasis on poverty in poor countries and what works and the causes and so forth, um, that again resonated with me because I was able to see the connection between what was going on around me and what my coursework um, was was explaining to me. And so at a very young age, I made that commitment that I wanted to be an economist and one specifically focused on disadvantaged populations, right? And in my naive younger mind, I thought that if I just studied more and went further in my studies, all the answers would be revealed to me, and I would, have all the answers to go fix my world. Of course, we know that's not how the world of academia works, but it was really a motivation for me. Well, I want you to imagine this. So, imagine me kind of bright-eyed, you know, relatively naive younger person, you know, thinking that, oh, I have this discipline that's going to teach me about all the ways that I can, be a force for good in my world. Um, and once I got to graduate school, and this is where most of the challenges started, um, the canon in economics can be very, abstract and theoretical, right? So those examples that I told you, they were actually just glimpses, right? It's like you get a glimpse of what could be, and that hooks you. But then the reality, or the majority of the coursework, was so different. A lot of it was very abstract. There was more of emphasis on, the math and the model, and less emphasis on the real world and the social part of economics, which is what drew me to the discipline. Um, and so, and not only that, there was less emphasis on things like poverty and inequality. Honestly, I went through my entire training, and I don't think I saw anything on inequality, right? If I did, it was probably at the end of, maybe one small section of one small chapter. But that was my main motivation. Um, and so that was very discouraging for me, right? Because I wasn't studying what I wanted to study and what I wanted um, to be trained in. So that's a big part of why this was a struggle. This dimension of reality that was, what I was experiencing, was completely missing from my training. And so of course it made it more challenging going through the process. And then the second challenge, relates to the first one, was a lack of mentors who could relate to this tension that I was feeling, around my race and my gender and where I came from, and having those kind of, hit up against the boundaries of the discipline that is so, focused on the US, that is so, white and male, and that has more of a neoclassical focus on efficiency and competition and profit maximization, rather than the broader ideas that I wanted to study, like inequality and poverty and so forth. Okay, so I would say twofold. Well, one is, growing up in that background of, you know a poorer country, lack of access to basic resources. It one first, it gave me that, um, push early on to make sure that the interests of people who are disadvantaged are actually represented in the economics discipline. And so I have that strong sense of, I have to make sure that the disadvantaged groups are not forgotten about, which is usually the case, right? Especially when you just follow the canon. But then secondly, I have an aunt right now who's 105 years old, and she has a very vivid long-term memory, and she remembers her grandfather, who was a slave in Jamaica, and her grandfather would tell her stories about him being a little slave boy on the farms in Jamaica. And so that really kind of pulls, in me when I think about economics research, that intergenerational component. And so I always, like to think about what are the intergenerational implications of what I am studying. And so that's another theme that I am interested in, from an economics perspective. A lot of times in discipline, the economics will discipline will think about your, current position is based on, or right, or your current endowment is just, you just show up in the marketplace with a certain endowment, or a certain level of skill. But in my experience, what you have today and who you are is based on what was passed down to you, right? And so I think that's an important component that is not, you know, talked about enough in the discipline, or doesn't, show up enough in both our coursework and our training and research and so forth. One, the idea alluded to, if growing up in an environment where I or the people around me had to make do with very little. And so there's always a consciousness of focusing on how policy or an event will affect those who are the most disadvantaged, right? And I think the way that economics has been practiced not only leads to some of these inequalities, it also provides a rationale for the continuation of the status quo, right? So there needs to be a voice for those who are disadvantaged to bring balance. And of course, when you think about the economics discipline, as I mentioned, that can be so white and male, being a black woman, that's kind of a countervailing force to that. And so, you know, one thing I try to do is not just to research in reaction to what other people are doing, but just to lean into who I am and let that be enough, right? That's all I can do, really. Um, so yeah, so the biggest part is just thinking about what ideas drove me initially to the discipline, and what ideas I am interested in researching and thinking about, and then just allowing that to flow naturally. And as a natural consequence, it is countervailing to what is there in the mainstream. There are many programs that have developed in this area, and what's interesting to observe is that these have developed outside of the mainstream, right? So this goes back to the issue of marginalization, where the programs are not always changing the mainstream, but developing things in the peripheral for people who are historically excluded, really, because that's what it is. But these programs do serve a great purpose, and I think they accomplish a lot of what they set out to do. For example, like the AEA programs at the undergraduate and graduate level. Um, there are other grant-funded programs like the Diversity Initiative for Tenure in Economics, which I went through, called DITE, and it's unfortunate because I'm not sure how true this is, but I heard that might be ending because the grant funding is running out. Um, but then there are other programs coming out of institutions and centers. Like I went through the Junior Scholars program out of the Center for Financial Security at University of Wisconsin. And then, of course, centers like the Center for Equitable Growth, which actually make an effort to be inclusive in their funding, because that has been an issue in the past, where the grants were geared towards researchers at more higher ranked institutions. Um, and then the Russell Sage Foundation, and again, I'm talking about programs that I was affiliated with, which launched the Pipeline Grant, and they provide a mentor that comes with the grant. I think those are very innovative project that has personally benefited me. But then there are also associations like the National Economic Association, and then the Association for Hispanic Economists, right? So these associations which pop up to make sure that these pathways are smoother for diverse researchers. Um, but as I mentioned, these programs kind of develop outside of the mainstream. But I think eventually the mainstream, main lane, has to become more welcoming of diverse perspective, and see diversity as a necessary ingredient in truly understanding the economy, right? So that these pathways are not essentially back roads and alternative routes, where the main route is kind of closed off to a lot of people who are historically excluded. Yeah, and this kind of goes back to what I hope, what the changes I hope to see in the economics profession. And I think a big part of it is um, one, in terms of economics teaching and training, right? It is very, one school of thinking that dominates a lot of universities. And that naturally creates feelings of exclusion for people who are not seeing their reality represented in the main canon of teaching, right? So that's a big part of it. And then second is, again, this goes back to the intergenerational component. Is that because Black and other diverse groups have been excluded in the past, there is not that as many senior mentors who are in a lot of departments across the country who are able and willing to address the types of topics that diverse groups are interested in, right? So that's a big one. Um, so again, and to go into the other question, I do hope to see a canon in terms of teaching of economics and training that is more pluralistic, um, that is more grounded in reality. Right. A lot of times, as I said, the models can abstract away from reality, so that you're getting an education that is not preparing you to understand how the real world works. Also, having different approaches to economic thinking, um, having economic history as an integral part of what we learn rather than just right what has happened in recent memory, and then just acknowledging the limitations of the dominant neoclassical theories that are taught in most departments, right? um, but on individual level, especially now that I'm on the other side as an academic and as a professor, just to make sure that we're not blindly teaching what was taught to us, right? And again, that becomes an issue of intergenerational um, continuation of the status quo, right? We're just going to reproduce the status quo. Um, not being afraid to discuss race and admit limitations around race, and hire economists who actually have expertise on race, right? And seeing it as a legitimate expertise to have. And it seems to me like a discipline that is so focused, that's that is so focused on the US. One, a lot of the models and theories um, take the US as kind of the model society we're studying, and majority of the world looks different from the US. And the US that is so racialized in an economic way, it's hard to say you're an expert on the US economy if you do not understand how race operates in an economic sense. But also in terms of teaching, being explicit about socializing teachers and students alike to be more welcoming of diverse groups and people and thinking. All right. But I think our approach has to be broader than that, right? So there has to be a different way of thinking about the economy, about theorizing and modeling the economy, and being willing to move away from the things that have been taught to care about to the exclusion of other things. For example, we focus a lot on values such as scarcity and competition and efficiency and profit. But I think ideas of forgiveness and justice and shared humanity should be as important to our modeling of the economy as those other values that I just mentioned, right? Um, we're making that fundamental assumption that people are motivated by individualistic ideas, but I think people are motivated as much by communal values as well. But we don't build that into our modeling of the economy, right? So we see the current economy that is a product of that sort of thinking, that is very exclusive, that is competitive, right? The idea of scarcity. If we allow more diverse people, there's going to be less for me. Those are quotes that I've heard from people, by the way. So that way of thinking has to change. Um, and then I think, kind of related to that point, being willing to support policies that actually work and are geared towards historically disadvantaged communities, and policies that have real material values. Sometimes when I see many policy proposals on the table that would be disproportionately beneficial to African Americans, and then I see economists vehemently object to them on the basis of efficiency, it can be disheartening, right? Especially when our current notions of efficiency are so limited. And so that's also another struggle in thinking about how our thinking leads to policy proposals that are exclusive of broader values that would actually benefit disadvantaged communities. I want to make it clear that it's a great way to make a living. For one, you feel like you're contributing to a common good, or there's a potential to contribute, right? Um, the other part is being able to engage creative and critical thinking skills. It's a very fulfilling way to spend your time. And as a professor, um, I teach and interact with the most amazing young people from around the world. And I think I enjoy being a professor specifically because I'm teaching economics. It is something that I've been passionate about for so long, and I can't believe that I get paid to read and think and write and talk about a topic that I find intrinsically interesting and fulfilling. And so, despite all the challenges, I am still grateful to be able to do what I do. I don't take a minute of it for granted, and I don't want, especially the younger economists coming through, to think that because of these barriers, the negatives outweigh the positives. Because, and again, it is my experience, um, and it turned out well for me. And this is another time to reiterate the importance of some of the organizations that have allowed me to be where I am today. Not just organizations, but people, right? It's made up of people. I've had great mentors, um, and people who've looked out for me and made sure I am included, right? People and foundations and centers. And um, I do feel a wind of change when it comes to those more foundational issues that I was talking about. So right now I am enjoying being in the discipline, despite all the challenges.